Hello, and welcome to Life Diaries, a space where the pages of life open up, one story at a time. These are tales written by experience, spoken from the heart. Take a moment for yourself, and let's begin. Little Tommy, perched on a bench, watched the endless stream of passers-by. Many faces, many fates, flickering before him. Some ambled leisurely along the park alleys. Others hurried somewhere. A colorful, multifaceted crowd. Among the strollers were children, tiny tots, teenagers, and those the same height as Tommy. These were held tightly by the hands of their adult companions, mothers and fathers, grandmas and grandpas. Tommy arrived at this park with his mother. A long train journey preceded their appearance here. For the boy, this was his first such trip. Never before had he seen gigantic, steaming steel giants, from which emanated a strange, yet somehow pleasant aroma. At the station, unaccustomed to such a sight, he even felt a slight fear. "What, a little girl, are you?" Uncle Rick chuckled, noticing how Tommy recoiled from the thundering train. "And your mother swore she gave birth to a boy." Tommy couldn't stand Uncle Rick. This loud, perpetually unshaven man, exuding malice, evoked only revulsion in him. But his mother, it seemed, felt differently towards him. She hugged him, kissed him, gently stroked his hair, and tried to please him in everything. Tommy simply couldn't grasp what could be found attractive in this man. When Uncle Rick first crossed the threshold of their apartment, he even initially appealed to the boy, for he didn't come empty-handed. He brought cake, sweets, juice, and flowers for his mother. It seemed like a holiday had arrived in the house. And Tommy loved holidays. The man stayed, settling in their small dwelling with creaky floorboards and wide windowsills. Tommy loved his home immensely. So old, so dear, wooden, two-story, with neighbors who were invariably kind to the boy. He didn't understand why the adults called this place an old barracks, and lamented that it was long overdue for demolition. Why? Where? It's so wonderful living here. This is the best place in the world, Tommy once hotly declared to a neighbor, old Grandma Betty, who often chatted with the curious little boy and treated him to something tasty. She laughed so infectiously that tears came to her eyes, and then suddenly grew sad and hugged Tommy very tightly. Grandma Betty was good, immensely kind. The boy missed her on this trip, although the first adventure in his life captivated him. Grandma Betty didn't like Uncle Rick either. She called him a tyrant, a drunkard, and a worthless person. Tommy didn't know the exact meaning of these words, but by the way the neighbor pronounced them, he understood. They were something very bad. And the boy wholeheartedly agreed with Grandma Betty. With Uncle Rick's appearance in their apartment, his mother's former friends stopped dropping by. And perhaps that was for the best, because they spent nights on end in the kitchen, laughing, making noise, often arguing, and even coming to blows. At such moments, Tommy would crawl under the bed, fearing he might get caught in it too. It was terrifying and unpleasant. But Uncle Rick scared everyone away. A semblance of silence reigned in the house. But, alas, not for long. The man turned out to be much worse than his mother's friends. He cursed at his mother and Tommy, constantly showed dissatisfaction, demanded unquestioning obedience. And then people started coming to the apartment again. Only now they were Uncle Rick's friends. Just as gloomy, just as unkind as he was. Tommy was afraid of them. Immensely afraid. He imagined that these people were capable of harming him or his mother. Sometimes Uncle Rick would kick Tommy out of the apartment saying, "Get lost, you're annoying," and lock the door. The boy tried to explain that it was freezing outside or pouring rain, that he would sit quietly like a mouse in his room and wouldn't bother anyone. But Uncle Rick was adamant, and his mother echoed him in everything. so the boy would wander for hours in the deserted yard. It was a blessing if Grandma Betty met him and took him to her place. Cleanliness reigned in the old woman's apartment, and the aroma of something tasty invariably wafted through it. And although Tommy adored his own home, looking at Grandma Betty's bright little rooms, the child understood. Their own apartment was constantly in chaos. The neighbor didn't have empty bottles lying around in corners, and there was no dust, dirt, or trash on the floor. Cabinets filled with books were piled along the walls. Tommy loved to look at the pictures in them for a long time. Grandma Betty even undertook to teach him to read. The process progressed rapidly. The boy was already putting letters together into words. It was like magic. Incomprehensible squiggles suddenly acquired a quite tangible meaning. But the learning process had to be interrupted. "Tomorrow we are leaving this place," his mother announced one day. "I've already packed." "Well, there's nothing to pack there anyway." Uncle Rick's hoarse voice came from the next room. "And where are we going?" Tommy asked. "To a better life," his mother answered evasively. "Somewhere where everything will be completely different." That night, Tommy couldn't close his eyes. Excitement didn't let go. So many thoughts crowded in his little head. Anticipation of a miracle settled in his heart. Something special, something completely new was coming soon. The unknown was slightly frightening, but the changes still filled him with joy. In the morning, Tommy was barely woken up. "Get up quick, or we'll leave and you'll stay here," Uncle Rick barked, watching his mother's futile attempts to lift her sleepy son from the sofa. Tommy jumped up instantly. He understood. Uncle Rick wasn't joking or threatening. He was truly capable of such a thing. It was just like him. The station greeted the boy with a colorful, inviting hustle and bustle. Tommy tightly squeezed his mother's hand. Her hands, however, were busy with bags. The little boy was immensely afraid of getting lost in this vast sea of people. And then they got onto the platform, and before the astonished boy's eyes appeared the train. Huge, steaming hot, gleaming and threateningly puffing, like a red-hot iron. Grandma Betty. The boy was seeing a real locomotive for the first time. No, of course, there were pictures of trains in Grandma Betty's books, but an illustration was one thing, and seeing such a giant machine with your own eyes was quite another. The train simultaneously frightened and fascinated him. "What are you gaping at like an idiot?" Uncle Rick roughly nudged the stunned Tommy. "Let's go," his mother agreed and moved towards the carriage. Inside was even better than Tommy could have imagined. Uncle Rick and his mother settled on the lower berths, and he was seated on the upper one. From there, it was immensely comfortable and interesting to observe the life of the carriage. And what views opened up from the window. Tommy even fell silent for several hours, which didn't happen often with him. Forests, fields, and villages rushed by. It turns out the world is so huge, so beautiful. How he wished he could wander in those groves, throw stones into the rivers and lakes flashing outside the window. And sometimes oncoming trains passed on the neighboring tracks, passenger and freight. The most interesting were those carrying machinery. Tommy took a liking to the clatter of the wheels. It soothed him, promised adventures and joyful encounters. When dusk thickened outside the window and his mother told her son to get ready for bed, Tommy lay and listened to this measured rhythm. It lulled the boy, tired from the abundance of new impressions. In the morning, Tommy was awakened by a long train whistle. The boy at first didn't even realize where he was and was slightly frightened. Then he remembered everything, smiled, hung his head down, made sure his mother and Uncle Rick were sleeping peacefully on the lower berths, calmed down, and stared out the window again. The train was speeding through an unusually picturesque hilly area. The landscapes were mesmerizing, making his tiny heart contract with delight. Tommy suddenly felt an intense desire to take an album, pencils, and try to capture this beauty. Only, Only he didn't have an album or pencils. All that was left at Grandma Betty's. It was she who gave him such things, while his mother and Uncle Rick believed that spoiling children was unnecessary and that a 4-year-old child couldn't draw anyway. After some time, the adults woke up. All three slowly ate bread with sausage, washing it down with tea from glasses and silver holders. It was immensely delicious. And then the boy was ordered to climb back onto the upper berth. "And make sure you sit there quietly," Uncle Rick warned. "Otherwise, they'll notice and kick you off. You don't have a ticket, you're riding for free." Tommy was scared by these words and obediently took his place. He liked being on the upper berth, but his legs were already numb. He immensely wanted to walk through the carriage, look at the fellow travelers, make acquaintances, maybe even run a little in the narrow corridor. Only Uncle Rick made it clear. He couldn't. And what would happen if he disobeyed? Tommy didn't even dare to imagine. After some time, the train stopped. Tommy looked out the window. They were standing at a crowded station. Probably they had arrived in some big city. "Let's take a walk," his mother suddenly suggested. "Let's stretch our legs a bit. The stop is long. We'll have time. Let's get some fresh air." "Perfect spot for it," Uncle Rick approved. Tommy was immensely happy. Finally he would go outside. He wondered what kind of city this was. What were the people like here? What were the streets like? Now everything would become clear. It was good that Uncle Rick wasn't coming with them. Tommy liked walking with his mother, just the two of them. Lately, that hadn't happened often, and now, unexpected joy. At the station, his mother bought Tommy a delicious jam pastry. The boy walked, tightly holding her hand, and looking around with curiosity. What a beautiful place. Passers-by smiled at the wide-eyed little boy. The sun poured generously from the sky. Sparrows chirped. "I wish we could stay here forever," Tommy dreamily sighed. His mother smiled strangely. Then they found themselves in a park. There were so many wondrous swings, so many delightful slides. In his own city, Tommy had never seen such splendor. "Can I?" he asked his mother, gazing at the bright playground. "Of course," his mother nodded. She sat down on a bench opposite and waved her hand as if saying, Go and play. I'll wait here." Tommy rushed to the playground with all his might. He spun on carousels and swung on swings, overcame rope labyrinths, jumped on a trampoline. His delight was boundless. What happiness that he and his mother had gone for a walk in this wonderful city. Many children were playing around. They laughed and had fun, chasing each other. Tommy joined first one group, then another. No one chased him away. On the contrary, they were happy about his appearance. And that was right, because the more people, the merrier. Finally, Tommy felt immensely tired and missed his mother. Besides, he was noticeably hungry. He wondered how long he had spent on this wonderful playground, and why he hadn't been called yet. It was time to go back. The boy rushed to the bench where his mother had been sitting. But the bench was empty. On the neighboring bench, 2 old women were comfortably seated, looking after their grandchildren. On the next one, a man with a stroller. There were no more benches near the playground. And his mother wasn't there either. How could this be? Where was his mother? What had happened to her? Maybe she just went to buy water or a pastry and would be back soon, and would even laugh at Tommy for being such a scaredy cat. As long as she didn't tell Uncle Rick, otherwise he'd tease him about being a girl again. The boy perched next to the old women, who, absorbed in conversation, paid no attention to him. His mother had been sitting on this very bench, the neighboring one. So she would come back here. How else? Time flowed relentlessly. The old women called their grandchildren and left. The other benches also emptied. There were almost no children left on the playground. Dusk was falling. But Tommy still sat, as if glued, and waited for his mother. He was cold and hungry. He was immensely scared. Adults hurried past on their business. Tommy tried to spot a familiar, so dear face in the crowd. But deep down, the little one began to understand. His mother wasn't coming. Something terrible had happened. Something unimaginable. Maybe his mother was lost? Or had that evil Uncle Rick appeared and taken her away, ordering Tommy to stay here? His mother always listened to him after all. What should he do? It was so scary, so cold, so lonely. And the people no longer seemed as friendly as they had in the morning, and the sun no longer shone so brightly and welcomingly. Even the playground didn't bring joy. Look, all the swings are free now. Sit on whichever one you want, you don't even have to queue. But he didn't want to at all. And suddenly the boy caught sight of something familiar in the crowd. No, it wasn't his mother. An elderly woman was walking slowly along the road, remarkably similar to Grandma Betty. Not so much in appearance, but in her expression, walk, and mannerisms. Tears inexplicably welled up in Tommy's eyes at that very moment. This woman couldn't be mean. Like Grandma Betty, she would help him in a difficult hour, tell him what to do next, support him, calm him down. The boy jumped off the bench, ran up to the stranger with the kind face. He couldn't delay. What if she passed by now and got lost in the crowd? "Hello, ma'am," Tommy greeted her first thing. Grandma Betty always said that politeness wins cities and told her little neighbor about the importance of good manners. "Well, hello there, little one." The woman looked surprised, but immensely kind. Her eyes were as blue and radiant as Grandma Betty's. This discovery gave Tommy confidence. "Do you happen to know where my mom is? I'm very cold now, and I want to eat, and she's still not here." A flicker of anxiety crossed the woman's face. She knelt down in front of the boy so their eyes were on the same level. "Little one, are you lost?" "I don't know, honestly," Tommy replied. "But I think it's not me who's lost, but Mom. I stayed where she left me, but she's nowhere to be found." Eleanor had lingered at the clinic. Her blood pressure had been acting up lately, so she had to visit periodically. "Age, what did you expect?" the district nurse would say, shrugging, and prescribe more pills and referrals for tests. Age? Yes, she wasn't a girl anymore. A whole year in well-deserved retirement, she could hardly believe it. Eleanor had dedicated her whole life to sewing. She worked at a large factory in several shifts, toiled at private enterprises, and did orders at home. Immensely difficult times, when there was barely enough for daily bread, had sunk into oblivion. Eleanor still vividly remembered the despair of those days. It was then that the incident occurred for which the woman blamed herself for the rest of her life. Sometimes it seemed that her conscience had quieted down, that she had managed to convince herself that it was impossible to act otherwise. But then the guilt returned, pressing with new force. Outwardly, Eleanor remained calm and even appeared cheerful. No one could have guessed what heavy thoughts were churning in her head. She and her husband rarely touched upon memories of what had happened. Eleanor suspected that he too suffered deeply inside. At least, a hidden sadness was often visible in her husband's eyes. Of course, something like that is impossible to forget. Those were the harsh 90s. Eleanor was constantly at work, toiling in 2 shifts. She would crawl home in the evenings, exhausted, worn out. The young woman's legs, back, and arms literally ached from fatigue and overexertion. Her eyes watered. They paid pennies for this work, and even those were regularly delayed, citing the difficult economic situation. "Nobody's keeping you here," the director would answer all those who were unhappy. "If you don't want to work, write a resignation. There's a queue for your spot, rest assured." And that was the absolute truth. Enterprises were collapsing one after another. People were left without means of subsistence. Eleanor understood that she wouldn't find work in the city and therefore endured. She worked overtime, went in on weekends. She came home squeezed like a lemon. And in the small apartment they rented from a very principled old woman, their 2-year-old Sarah was waiting for them. Eleanor's husband usually managed to pick up the little girl from kindergarten by the time she returned. The man had recently lost his job. The promising engineer now scraped by with odd jobs in the evenings, sometimes driving a taxi, sometimes unloading trucks, sometimes helping out on construction sites. He wasn't laid off, but finding a new place proved immensely difficult. Her husband had even given up on his qualifications, looking for an electrician vacancy. His education allowed him to work in this field, but the times were such, work was nowhere to be found. So he scraped by with odd jobs. The young couple's parents couldn't help the family. They themselves were barely making ends meet, and they were already elderly. Both Eleanor and her husband were late children in their families. The situation was more than desperate. But Eleanor remembered those times even with a kind of nostalgia. She and her husband were young and loved each other immensely. It seemed then that everything would work out, that the financial difficulties wouldn't last forever. Their beloved daughter was nearby, delighting them with new achievements every day. And most importantly, they hadn't yet committed the act for which they now felt guilty. Their conscience was absolutely clear, which is why life was easier and calmer then, despite the financial troubles. Eleanor clearly remembered the day she found out she was pregnant again. Lately, she hadn't been feeling well. At first, she dismissed the alarming symptoms, attributing them to lack of sleep, nerves, and poor nutrition. But then she stopped by the doctor after work anyway. "You're pregnant," the doctor delivered the verdict after the examination. "And already 12 or 13 weeks. Strange that you didn't notice earlier. It's not your first time." Eleanor sat as if struck by lightning. She, of course, understood that something was wrong with her body, but attributed it to the effects of stress and hard work. Without thinking, the woman immediately wanted to sign up for a termination. She perfectly remembered how happy she was at the news of her first pregnancy. Now, Eleanor felt only fear. She clearly understood that their family, on the verge of survival, couldn't handle another child. Somewhere deep down, the woman immensely wanted to become a mother again, to feel that wonderful feeling again. But now it seemed impossible. "A termination? What termination?" the doctor asked tiredly, irritation visible on his face. "Did you hear the term I mentioned? It's too late now. You'll have to give birth." Eleanor barely made it home. Tiny hammers pounded in her temples. Burning tears welled up in her eyes. A mix of feelings battled in her soul. From joy, strangely enough, to despair. And thoughts. They staged some frantic dance in Eleanor's head. Her subconscious furiously searched for a way out of the situation. Find a healer who could help get rid of the fetus? That was terrifying. That was dangerous. Try working from home to support the growing family? Unreliable, problematic with a big belly, and then with 2 little ones in the house. Eleanor was so absorbed in her thoughts that she started crossing the road on a red light. The indignant honk of a car brought her back to her senses. She needed to pull herself together, share the news with her husband. He was a man. Let him make the decision. Eleanor distinctly remembered the expression of fear and despair that appeared on her husband's face when he learned about the pregnancy. She probably looked the same herself at the doctor's office. "Well then," her husband said uncertainly, "since it happened, we'll have the baby. What else can we do?" "I think I found a job in a workshop." "But what kind of workshop?" "Just a guy reupholstering furniture in a garage. Plus, I'll work nights. We'll manage somehow. Since it happened." Her husband hugged Eleanor, trying to cheer her up. And then he got ready and slipped out of the house, A freight train was arriving at the station today, and porters were needed. The woman felt sharp pity for her husband. An excellent specialist, a brilliant mind. He was invaluable at his research institute, so many awards, so much respect. And now, a porter and an apprentice. It was upsetting. And this child. Because of him, they would both have to work even harder. But then little Sarah whimpered on the floor. Usually, she could play with her toys for a long time, and suddenly tears. The woman touched her forehead. It was hot. And Eleanor attended to her daughter. All other thoughts and problems receded for a while. This second, unwanted pregnancy was immensely difficult. Eleanor often felt unwell, nauseous, dizzy, dark spots flickering before her eyes. All this, of course, affected her work. Firing a pregnant woman wasn't that easy, but the director forced her to write a resignation letter. "I don't need workers like you, constant sick leave, not meeting quotas. If you don't write your own resignation, I'll fire you under the article about professional unsuitability, and then you won't find work anywhere with such a black mark." There was even less money. Her husband, of course, tried immensely hard, working in the furniture reupholstery workshop, taking any odd job. But there was a catastrophic lack of money for living. And now a baby would appear soon. Eleanor felt nothing for the infant stirring under her heart. She had awaited her daughter with love and joy, talked to her, sang her songs. But she considered the younger child a burden, determined to ruin their lives. She scolded herself for such thoughts, but couldn't help it. And only just before the birth itself, when it was time to prepare the infant's layette, Eleanor softened a little, because she was sure that this time she was expecting a son. And so she sewed him several wonderful blue little suits and rompers, stitched diapers with airplanes. Looking at all these tiny things, the woman for the first time felt some warm feelings towards the belly dweller. That's what her husband jokingly called the baby. He, on the other hand, eagerly awaited his arrival, made plans, even managed to be happy, although he was immensely tired from his jobs. The baby came into the world on a stormy November night. In between painful contractions, Eleanor heard gusts of wind beating against the windows and cold rain drumming. Finally, a wrinkled, crying red creature was placed on the exhausted woman's chest. "A boy," the midwife reported indifferently and hurried to another woman in labor. Eleanor looked at her son and couldn't comprehend her feelings. She expected that upon seeing the little one, she would be filled with tenderness towards him. That's how it was the first time. But now the woman only thought about how to feed and raise this extra mouth. The baby was taken away. She was sent to the ward. Eleanor sank into sleep with pleasure. She was immensely tired both physically and emotionally. And in the morning, sad news awaited her. After the babies were brought for feeding and taken away, the doctor came into the ward. She said a few words to each mother about their babies, but asked Eleanor to come to her office in half an hour. The woman froze. She understood that something was wrong with her child. Otherwise, why such special attention? At the appointed time, Eleanor, on stiff legs, entered the chief doctor's office. "Have a seat." The woman in the white coat smiled tiredly, gesturing towards the armchair in front of the desk. "It turns out the newborn boy has serious heart and kidney problems. He requires treatment, lifelong treatment. The medications are available, but they are expensive." "We have no money at all," Eleanor stammered, freezing. Yes, she hadn't fallen in love with the newborn at first sight, but he was her son. And the news of his illnesses was a cruel blow. And then, expensive medications. Where would they get the money for them if they were barely making ends meet? The doctor began talking about funds that help families in such difficult situations. It turns out there are also sponsors in the city who support sick children. But you have to ask, collect documents, knock on every door. There will be a way out. The main thing is the desire, the tired woman in the white coat assured the shocked mother. It was easy for her to say. She wasn't the one who had given birth to a sick child. And then there was the discharge, and the difficult life began with a sick newborn, a capricious 3-year-old. And all this amidst a family financial catastrophe. They decided to name their son Daniel. The name was chosen by her husband. That was the name of his great-grandfather. The ancestor was distinguished by excellent health, lived almost to 100 years, and all that time in his right mind and on his own feet. The man believed that the name would help the new Daniel to get healthy and strong. Eleanor didn't object. Daniel is Daniel. It made no difference. She herself didn't want to think about a name for the boy at all. The child turned out to be immensely restless. He cried a lot, slept little, ate poorly. Sarah, jealous of her mother towards the new family member, literally became uncontrollable, constantly capricious and demanding attention. Eleanor was going crazy from all this. But the most important thing was Daniel's health problems. They were confirmed at the children's clinic. It turned out the situation was even worse than initially thought. The child required lifelong therapy with expensive medications. Charitable foundations partially paid for the medications, but still, a large part of the family budget now went to treatment. Eleanor perfectly understood that Daniel was not to blame for anything, but still practically hated this tiny tormentor for all the difficulties he caused their family. Eleanor didn't recognize herself. She had always believed that the defining traits of her personality were kindness, mercy, compassion. How could a woman who used to not pass by a hungry kitten calmly think such things about her sick, tiny son? But you can't command your feelings. It was only later that Eleanor understood and analyzed her state at the time. A difficult pregnancy, the preceding work in several shifts, lack of money, serious diagnoses for the child, lack of help, lack of prospects, all together led to a severe state. And this is immensely serious and requires treatment by a specialist. But who thought about professional psychological support in those harsh times? Just surviving was enough. Anyway, after a year it became clear. The family was no longer able to cope with a disabled child, neither morally, nor financially, nor physically. Eleanor was the first to suggest a way out. "We can't cope with Daniel," she said to her husband one evening, looking him seriously in the eye. "It's obvious he's getting worse. We can't even buy him medicine. We're constantly saving on everything, denying ourselves everything, depriving Sarah, and still we can't cope." "I'm trying." Her husband lowered his eyes. He didn't even argue. It was obvious his wife was telling the truth. "You're trying, I see. You'll wear yourself out soon. You're not made of steel. And then we'll be completely lost. It can't go on like this. We need to do something about this urgently. I think we should put him in a special institution. At least they'll provide him with medication there. I checked. The treatment of orphaned children is paid for by the state budget." "To an orphanage? Are you suggesting giving up on our son?" Her husband looked at his wife with eyes wide with horror. Unlike her, he clearly felt warm feelings for Daniel. He talked to him, played with him, constantly smiled at the boy, carried him on his back when he had a free moment. Of course, that didn't happen often. Work took up most of his time. "Well, what's the alternative?" Eleanor burst into a shout. "Watch him slowly fade away before our eyes? Spend all our money on hopeless treatment, depriving Sarah? Should we all starve for his sake?" Her husband didn't answer then, but Eleanor saw. He was seriously thinking about her words. Intellectually, the man understood that a seriously ill child was indeed beyond their means right now. But deciding on such a desperate step was difficult, immensely difficult. Eleanor understood him in this. Daniel was already 1 year old. He was strikingly similar in appearance to his mother. Large blue eyes, light curly hair, a slightly upturned nose. An incredibly sweet child, simply an angel from a postcard. Only immensely thin. Perhaps his appearance would play into Daniel's hands, and he would find wealthy parents for whom the amount needed for his treatment was mere pennies. And he would have a happy, prosperous, long life. But they themselves couldn't handle Daniel. It was obvious. Rented housing, lack of stable work. Daniel wasn't the kind of child you could put in kindergarten at 2 years old and go back to work. He needed constant attention and supervision. No employer would agree to never-ending sick leave. And it was terrifying to think what would happen to the child without the necessary therapy. They couldn't provide him with adequate treatment. So Eleanor saw only one way out. At first, her husband tried to take control of the situation. He found another part-time job, didn't come home for days in the hope of providing the family with everything they needed. But in the end, he too understood that it was time for decisive action. Eleanor clearly remembered the morning she and her husband arrived at the orphanage. The special institution was in a neighboring region. The couple had arranged with the director beforehand, so the family was expected in the office. They were met by a middle-aged woman with immensely anxious eyes. Looking at her husband, who was tenderly holding Daniel close, she clarified, "Are you sure you've decided? There won't be hysterics, tears, accusations against us later?" "Yes, we've thought it all through. We have no other option," Eleanor answered confidently. She wanted to get the difficult procedure over with quickly. The little boy was smiling, happy to be going somewhere with Mom and Dad, looking at Eleanor trustingly. It was unbearable. "Well, all right," the director sighed. "The papers are ready. Read them and sign. The child will be taken now." At these words, the father instinctively hugged Daniel even tighter. Eleanor also reached out to the little boy but stopped herself. Everything was decided. It would be for the best. For them, and for their son. Soon, only the adults remained in the office. Daniel was taken by a nanny. She managed to cast a judgmental glance at Eleanor. She endured it quite calmly. Anyone who hadn't been in such a situation had no right to blame them for anything. Well, then life went on as usual. To prevent the neighbors from bothering them with questions, the couple rented another apartment in a remote area. Eleanor went back to work. Life seemed to get easier, but the thought of the little boy left in the orphanage, of course, couldn't help but torment both parents. Husband and wife tried not to talk about their action, silently stewing in their own feelings. Eleanor gave herself many arguments for such a decision. Daniel was receiving the necessary treatment. They were raising their elder daughter properly, not depriving her of attention or material comforts. Her husband wasn't slaving away at several jobs at once. He looked like a human being again, not a tormented zombie. It was better for everyone this way. And yet, at night the woman often couldn't sleep, constantly trying to imagine what Daniel's life was like in the orphanage. Was he well fed there? Was he hurt? Or maybe a wealthy family had already adopted him a long time ago. Her husband also worried, tossing and turning sleeplessly beside her, but remained silent. The man tried to lose himself in work. The furniture reupholstery workshop gradually turned into a large firm. He had to work tirelessly, but the money was also sufficient. Things at Eleanor's work were also going well, and generally, the economic situation in the country changed immensely. The family had money. Over time, the couple could afford an apartment, their own, not rented. And then they bought a car. Now they went to the sea every summer, something they couldn't even dream of before. Sometimes Eleanor thought that if Daniel had been born now, they wouldn't have even thought about putting him in an orphanage. Now they could buy their son all the necessary medications and even have an expensive operation. Apparently, her husband had similar thoughts, because one day, when Sarah was already fast asleep in her room, he decided to have a serious talk. "How old is our son now?" 10 years old, almost 11, the woman answered quietly. In all the time that had passed since visiting the orphanage, the couple hadn't often dared to talk about the boy. Sarah didn't remember at all that she once had a brother. I was thinking, what if we could take him back? Yes, I think about it constantly, but I'm afraid, would he forgive us? Would he understand? And he's probably been adopted a long time ago. So you're not against it? Relief shone on the man's face. I've been thinking about it for a long time. I just didn't know how to talk to you about it. Of course, I'm not against it. This wild feeling of guilt has tormented me all these years. The woman finally confessed her feelings and immediately felt relief, as if a weight had been lifted from her soul. Sarah, how do we tell her about this? Right tomorrow? Let's tell her. Just find the words. She might react in who knows what way. She's a teenager after all. Eleanor thought. Sarah often asked her parents for a little brother or sister. But after what they had been through, the couple couldn't even think about another child. And now, at such a tender age, their daughter would suddenly learn about the terrible deed of her mom and dad. How would she react to it? It was terrifying even to imagine. Let's not tell her anything for now, Eleanor decided. First, we'll go to the orphanage, find out the situation, meet Daniel, and then we'll see. They didn't postpone the trip. The very next weekend, the couple got in the car and went to the neighboring region along the same road as 10 years ago. They told their daughter they were visiting her father's friend. The orphanage hadn't changed at all over the years, except maybe more swings and slides had appeared in the yard. The director was the same woman who had spoken to the bewildered couple back then, on that terrible day that divided their lives into before and after. She recognized them immediately. I remember you, the woman stated, examining the visitors. You left a boy here. That was about 10 years ago, I think. Your story is unusual. That's why I remember it. Usually we get children from troubled families. A case like yours is rare. We would like to take our son back. Eleanor immediately got to the point. Is that so? Confusion was reflected on the director's face. We were living below the poverty line then, her husband began to explain. We couldn't provide for the children adequately, and Daniel also needed treatment. That's why we took that step. Now everything has improved, and you decided that the orphanage was like temporary care for the child? Bad situation? You handed him over to the state, then you changed your mind and just took him back? The director didn't hide her irritation. You shouldn't judge us without having been in our shoes, Eleanor warned. She wanted to say much more to this arrogant woman, but she didn't. Angering her now would be foolish. They depended too much on the orphanage director. You won't be able to take your son back. He's not with us anymore. And where is he? Eleanor jumped up. Where is Daniel now? That I cannot tell you, the director answered dryly. And now, be so kind as to leave my office. Why won't you tell us? Is it adoption secrecy? Just give us a hint. The father persisted, confident that he would leave the orphanage with his son. Leave the premises, the woman repeated in an icy tone. Otherwise, I will be forced to call security. First they abandon a child, then they demand him back. There was nothing to be done. The couple left the office empty-handed. On the porch, a nanny approached them. A plump, elderly woman with kind, sad eyes and a wonderfully wrinkled face. Are you Daniel's parents? She asked with sympathy, looking at the bewildered visitors. Did you leave him here because you couldn't afford to treat and feed him? Yes, and we are those very villains, the man replied. Well, why villains? Don't listen to our director. She's terribly mean, a bad person. And do you know anything about Daniel? Eleanor looked at the nanny with hope. Of course I do. The old woman sighed sadly. Oh, the little boy is just like his mother. The same blue eyes, The same light hair. That's where such a handsome boy came from. What happened to him? Where is he? I have nothing to cheer you up with. The nanny lowered her eyes. He's not alive. His heart gave out 4 years ago. They didn't make it to the hospital, so the expensive medications didn't help. The ground disappeared from under Eleanor's feet. The woman stumbled. She almost fell. Her pale husband barely managed to hold her by the shoulders. I thought, well, it's better for you to know the truth. The nanny continued her speech. You are his parents after all. Otherwise, you would have started searching, hired some detectives, hoped for years, and then still found this out. Thank you for the truth, Eleanor forced out. It really is better this way. How can we live now? Yes, I understand. It's hard, the old woman agreed. But you have to live. You are not to blame for anything. The little boy was sick. Without treatment in your family, it would have happened even sooner. And here, Daniel had a good life. Everyone loved him. The boy was immensely kind and affectionate, and smart, too. The couple remained silent the entire way home. Eleanor understood that the nanny was right. Daniel was doomed from birth. But she couldn't help but blame herself for being cowardly then. Even if her son had lived less, he would have been surrounded by loving relatives, not strangers. The woman understood. This guilt would now stay with her forever, and nothing could atone for it. Of course, the couple didn't tell Sarah anything. Daniel remained a great secret. Even with each other, the couple never again spoke about their son and his fate. Immensely terrifying, immensely difficult. But of course, the parents couldn't help but think about him. Not a day passed that Eleanor didn't remember her little boy. She secretly prayed for him, lit candles in church, and constantly reproached herself for her faint-heartedness. The realization that nothing could be changed now weighed heavily on her. To her own surprise, Eleanor gradually got used to this life. The feeling of guilt became a part of her personality, without which the woman no longer conceived of herself. Her daughter grew up and went to study in London, then got a job there, settled in the capital. She was no longer nearby, which saddened the parents. But at the same time, they were proud of Sarah's successes and were ready to accept her departure, as long as their girl was doing well. Eleanor had recently retired. Her husband was still working. The workshop in the garage had turned into a large furniture factory, and Eleanor's husband was a department head there, an important person with a solid salary. He liked his work. The woman suspected that work allowed her husband to distract himself from sad thoughts. Eleanor finally immersed herself in housekeeping. She had worked her whole life. There wasn't enough time for the house. But now their apartment was perfectly tidy, and the table was laden with culinary masterpieces. It turned out that taking care of loved ones was a pleasant pastime, not a heavy duty, as it had seemed before. True, there weren't enough people to take care of now. Only her husband and their unpretentious cat Whiskers. But Eleanor was still happy. She dreamed of grandchildren, whom her daughter would bring to Grandma and Grandpa for holidays. Oh, she would spoil Sarah's children. Soon, very soon, little ones would appear in Eleanor's life, in addition to Tommy and Lily, who had already become like family. The only thing that clouded the woman's measured life, apart from the usual thoughts about Daniel, of course, was her deteriorating health. And now Eleanor was returning from the clinic. She deliberately chose the route through the park. She liked it here. Beautiful, crowded, spacious, and so many swings for children. This is where she would bring her grandchildren. The sooner the better. Eleanor even smiled at her dreams of grandchildren. She suddenly clearly pictured a boy and a girl, twins. A plaintive, thin voice pulled the woman out of her sweet dreams. A tiny boy was tugging at Eleanor's coat sleeve. He looked no older than 3 or 4 years old. Wide-open blue eyes, a slightly upturned nose sprinkled with freckles, light curly hair peeking out from under his hat. A real angel from a picture, only immensely thin. The child was remarkably reminiscent of Daniel. Eleanor had last seen her son at 1 year old, but she had no doubt. At 3 or 4 years old, he looked exactly like this little boy. Her heart ached painfully. The woman had to take a deep breath to compose herself. The child spoke again, and his words made Eleanor start. The boy clearly needed help. "I'm cold, I'm hungry, and Mom's still not here." The little one looked bewildered and frightened. He looked at Eleanor with eyes full of hope. The woman took his hand firmly, and they walked slowly around the park several times together, looking for the little boy's mother. The boy, who introduced himself as Tommy, diligently peered around, but he didn't see his mother. "Let's go to the station," Eleanor decided. "Maybe your mother put out an announcement and they're looking for you everywhere." The woman, tightly holding the little boy's hand, found the duty booth. A man in uniform assured her that no missing child reports had been received today. No one had been hit by a train, and generally the whole day had been surprisingly quiet and peaceful. "And what should we do with him now?" Eleanor asked confusedly, gesturing with her eyes towards the frightened, tired little boy. "What to do? What to do? Children go to the police," the duty officer replied. "Homeless kids often hang around the station, kids from troubled families, runaways from orphanages. This one definitely didn't run away from an orphanage." "Evil," Eleanor replied. The duty officer's indifference irritated her. The woman called a taxi and went to the police station with the little boy. The child fell sweetly asleep on the way, trustingly resting his heavy little head on her lap. Eleanor stroked the boy's light curly hair and was once again amazed at the resemblance of the foundling to Daniel. And perhaps this wasn't a coincidence? What if fate, in her old age, had sent them a chance to atone for their guilt? Tommy had been abandoned, that was obvious. Brought from somewhere far away, left on a playground in an unfamiliar city. Eleanor didn't even condemn his parents. Who knows what situations people have in life? She knew about that firsthand. True, of course, the little boy's mother acted carelessly, leaving her son in danger. Who knows who might have found the child? Bad people, stray dogs. Perhaps the bewildered, desperate woman simply didn't think about it. Eleanor was sure that only extreme need and despair could have driven Tommy's mother to such a step. Anyway, the little boy was unwanted. Most likely he would end up in an orphanage. So maybe take him into the family? Become his parents with her husband? Or rather, his grandma and grandpa. Her husband certainly wouldn't object. But of course, no one gave Tommy to Eleanor. The boy was taken to a children's hospital for examination, after which he would go to a boarding school. And his mother was declared missing. Eleanor talked her husband's ear off about the foundling at home. The very next weekend, they went together to visit the little boy in the hospital. Tommy was genuinely happy to see familiar faces, hugged Eleanor like a relative, and shook her husband's hand in a businesslike manner. Tommy turned out to be talkative, told his visitors about his hospital days, asked 1,000 questions about the world, shared observations about doctors and other adults around him. Eleanor fell more and more in love with this child, who was smart beyond his years, and saw that the same thing was happening to her husband. When it was time to part, Tommy hugged them tightly and didn't want to let go. Tears welled up in the little boy's eyes. "You are so good, so kind. I will miss you, like Grandma Betty." "Is that your grandma?" Eleanor seized on the thin thread. Perhaps there was a relative on this earth who cared about the blonde little boy. "Our neighbor in the barracks," Tommy replied. Eleanor sighed with disappointment. Just a neighbor. Since then, Eleanor and her husband often visited Tommy, first in the hospital, then in the orphanage, where the boy was transferred after the examination. The woman repeatedly asked the head of the orphanage to let her take the little one into her care. Eleanor imagined how good Tommy would be in their apartment. They would surround the little boy with care and love, take him for walks, feed him goodies, read him interesting books. But while the investigation was ongoing, that was out of the question. And then Tommy's mother finally showed up. She was found in a city by the sea, where she had decided to start a new life. Chloe, a young orphanage graduate, was enjoying freedom and luxurious sea landscapes. She didn't need a child. She easily left him in the park near the station. Her cohabitant, Rick, had advised her to do that. The man, twice Chloe's age, an experienced father of many children, suggested that if she put Tommy in an orphanage, his mother would then have to pay child support until he was 18. But this way, he got lost, and he got lost. How many such lost children are there across the country? Chloe and Rick even put out a missing child announcement, but they staged the loss of the little boy at a station almost 1,000 kilometers away from where they abandoned Tommy. Chloe received a real sentence for leaving a child in danger. She was sent to a women's colony. It was there that she wrote an official refusal of her unwanted son. Now, at least, Tommy had the status of an orphan. But Rick got off lightly, which seemed unfair to Eleanor, as it was he who had prompted Chloe to commit the terrible act. But for some reason, the man wasn't charged with complicity in the crime. Eleanor and her husband didn't think long about the serious step. Both had long sincerely loved Tommy and were happy to welcome him into their family. They talked about their adoption plans with their daughter. She was surprised, of course, but had nothing against a little stepbrother. She even seemed happy. However, the guardianship authorities refused the couple. "Where would you take such a young child?" the woman in horn-rimmed glasses explained, looking at the visitors with pity. "Your age isn't right, and your health isn't either. We don't have the right to give him to you because of your age, even though you seem to have all the conditions for raising a child." Eleanor and her husband returned home disappointed that day. They had already made plans on how to set up a nursery and what clubs to enroll the bright boy in. And then this happened. And what were they to do now? How could they tell Tommy that they wouldn't take him home, as they had promised? And why had they given the little boy hope prematurely? Why didn't they go to the guardianship authorities first? That was, of course, immensely foolish of them. The couple continued to visit Tommy at the orphanage. They brought gifts and sweets, walked with the boy around the grounds. The little boy had become completely dear to them. How could they give up on Tommy? How could they stop thinking about him? It was impossible. "I need to talk to Chloe, Tommy's mother," Eleanor declared to her husband one day. "Is that so? Why do you need to do that?" he wondered. "Maybe she'll write some kind of statement that she's giving the child specifically to us." "Tommy is nobody to her," the man reminded her. "She gave him up and has no right to make any decisions regarding him." "But maybe I'll learn something else important. I want to help Tommy, you understand? When I imagine that the boy will have to spend his whole life struggling in an orphanage. I understand. My own heart aches for him. I just don't even imagine how your meeting with his birth mother could help. But I feel that I need to see her." Suit yourself. Eleanor found out the city where the colony where Chloe, Tommy's mother, was serving her sentence was located. It wasn't close. The woman traveled for 2 days by train to northern Stepnovsk. Eleanor was in such a gloomy place for the first time. Grim staff, gray walls, oppressive atmosphere. It was even hard to breathe here. A silent woman in a blue camouflage uniform, after a thorough search, led the visitor to the visiting room. The room resembled a living room in a regular apartment. A sofa, 2 armchairs, a bedside table with a TV, a rug on the floor. Soon, Chloe was brought in. She turned out to be a very young girl, looking even younger than Sarah. Thin, dark-skinned, with angry black eyes. "Who are you?" she asked the visitor suspiciously. "I don't know you." Eleanor introduced herself and told her how she had found the frightened little boy in the park. "Oh, so it's because of you I'm here?" Chloe smirked. "If not me, others would have found him," the woman remarked fairly. "There were Roma people wandering nearby. I hoped they would take him with them. They need little ones to beg. Especially since Tommy has a Slavic appearance. People give more to such children." Eleanor felt anger boiling up inside her at this shameless girl who wished such a fate for her son. And how could such a wonderful little boy as Tommy have appeared to such an unprincipled, selfish mother? Maybe the boy took after his father? In appearance, he certainly didn't resemble his mother at all. "Where is Tommy's real father?" Eleanor asked. She suppressed her irritation by force of will and continued the conversation with Chloe in a calm, even tone. Tommy's fate now depended on this girl. She shouldn't be angered. "Father?" Chloe snorted. "He lives somewhere, got married, and I think he had a daughter. Things happened quickly for David, but he swore his love to me, asked me to come back with Tommy, begged to be allowed to see him." "Tell me more, please." Eleanor suddenly felt a glimmer of hope. It was unlikely, but what if Tommy's father was a normal person who would be happy to have such a son and would take him from the orphanage into his family? "What's there to tell?" Chloe grumbled and suddenly perked up. "All right, I'll tell you everything, but not for free." "How much?" Eleanor inquired. The girl thought about the sum. She clearly didn't want to sell herself short or scare away the visitor with too high a price. 5,000, I think, will be enough." Eleanor tried to hide her relief so as not to whet Chloe's appetite. "Okay." The woman agreed as if reluctantly, took half the amount from her wallet, and handed it to the girl. "The rest later." "Okay." Chloe immediately brightened up. "The story isn't original, but it's long. So, as they say, make yourself comfortable and listen." Chloe grew up in an orphanage. Her childhood was difficult. Hunger, cruel caregivers, humiliation, even beatings. Eleanor wondered to herself how this girl, having gone through such suffering, could deliberately condemn her own child to the same. Anyway, Chloe grew up. She was given a small apartment in a crumbling barracks. It was her own living space, however modest. Chloe was happy with both the long-awaited freedom and the separate housing. True, no one called her for lunch in the dining room on the first floor anymore. She had to earn a living herself. And Chloe didn't like to work. The young, attractive orphanage graduate quickly figured out how not to starve to death without slaving away at a job. She learned to live off her admirers, of whom there was no shortage. One day, Chloe met David on the street, a former classmate from the college the orphanage administration had once forced her to attend. The blue-eyed, modest blonde was in love with her. Chloe understood that perfectly well, but he didn't dare to confess. And the girl even deliberately amused herself, making the guy blush with unexpected phrases and requests. And then they accidentally ran into each other in the park. David looked much better than he had in college. He had matured and become more self-assured. It turned out he still had feelings for Chloe. It was strange, but immensely pleasant. Chloe took the guy in hand, and they started dating. David felt absolutely happy. He even proposed to the lady of his heart. But the guy had one significant drawback: strict parents who controlled their son's life. Of course, they wouldn't have been against such a daughter-in-law. And even if the wedding had taken place, David's mom and dad would have constantly watched Chloe's every move. And then she would have had to forget about carefree parties, romantic dates, and similar pleasant things. And David himself. Handsome, of course, reliable, but immensely. Just too proper and boring. Becoming his wife meant dedicating herself to family, household, and domesticity once and for all. But no, that was definitely not for Chloe. At least not yet. So the girl refused the proposal, rudely brushing off the smitten guy. And a couple of weeks later, she realized she was pregnant. And it was definitely David's. At first, she wanted to have a termination, but due to inexperience, she waited too long, and the hospital refused her. What to do? No money, no job, and she didn't want to slave away. One of her new acquaintances advised her to give birth. "Don't miss your chance," the experienced woman instructed. "Give birth. You'll get state benefits, and you'll shake money out of the father until the little one turns 18. Chloe thought about it. Yes, the prospects were indeed good. True, the young future mother didn't imagine what a child was like back then. It's not a doll that stays where you leave it. Chloe realized that motherhood was a punishment, hard labor, immensely quickly. The boy was born healthy, calm, according to those around them. But he turned his young mother's life into a nightmare. He constantly cried, demanded food, attention. It was unbearable. David at first only helped with money. Chloe didn't allow him to see the baby. She couldn't explain why, probably just out of spite. She liked feeling her power, her might. But then, when the infant completely exhausted Chloe, she finally needed David's physical help. The young father gladly spent time with the baby, changed him, walked with him outside, and Chloe could rest a little during that time. Then David started taking Tommy for overnights. The guy was already living separately from his parents, so their consent or prohibition didn't matter to him. Officially, David was nobody to the child. In Tommy's birth certificate, in the father column, Chloe asked for a dash to be put so she could receive the benefit. But in fact, it was David who raised the little boy from 6 months to about 2.5 years old. He worked remotely, so he managed to combine work and raising his son. Chloe lived as she had always dreamed. Entertainment, noisy parties, romantic dates, drinking that added color to the gray weekdays. There was money. The state regularly paid the child benefit, which David was actually raising and feeding. Admirers didn't skimp on drinks and snacks. Everything was working out wonderfully. Chloe considered it fate's reward for the hard years in the orphanage. One day, the guardianship authorities showed up at Chloe's apartment right in the middle of a party. It turned out David had decided to officially register Tommy as his son. He planned to get a DNA test to confirm paternity and deprive Chloe of her parental rights. He believed it was dangerous for the child to be with such a mother. The girl couldn't allow that, because then goodbye benefits. She threw a huge scandal at David, took her son, and forbade the guy from coming near them. "Otherwise, I'll file a police report. You're nobody to Tommy, a stranger. Let them figure out how you got the child. They'll accuse you and put you in prison." Chloe fumed. Her older friends taught her how to deal with the unhappy father of her child. Make him transfer money for his upkeep. He's obligated, since he's the father, even if unofficial. If you have a conscience, you'll help. But I won't let you see him anymore. David tried to reconcile. It was clear he had become attached to the boy and genuinely loved him. But Chloe remained unapproachable. She didn't need big problems that could be expected from David. Tommy grew older. There were far fewer problems and troubles with him. He could even be let out into the yard alone for a few hours. Let him play, get some fresh air. It was healthy. The neighbors, however, complained, saying she was a negligent mother for leaving such a little one unsupervised. But Chloe cared little for their opinion. A little over a year passed. Tommy had almost forgotten David. He also stopped reminding her of himself, though he still regularly transferred money for the baby's upkeep. One day, Chloe learned from mutual acquaintances that David had gotten married, and the young family was expecting an addition. The girl suddenly realized that this news upset her. Her own reaction immensely surprised Chloe. She hadn't thought that David's personal life mattered to her at all. And yet, the girl had been sure for a long time that David loved her and Tommy, that he was ready for anything for their sake. She could twist him around her little finger, manipulate him, play on his feelings. And then suddenly this. Well, all right. What was done was done. Chloe's life also saw another great love, Rick, a shift worker. Old enough to be her father, but strong, self-confident, knowing a thing or two about life, and with some money. With him, she wouldn't be lost. True, Tommy still got in the way of the adults. He needed to be fed, clothed, shod, taken to the clinic periodically. He asked 1,000 questions a minute, constantly demanded attention. A lot of money was spent on him. In short, Rick suggested getting rid of the boy. And a suitable opportunity presented itself. The couple decided to move permanently to a city by the sea. Rick had some friends or relatives there. The journey was long, long. A little boy could easily get lost somewhere along the way. Chloe didn't object. Early motherhood immensely burdened her, and the need to look after her son irritated her. Of course, she could have given him to David, but then it would mean he had won. And Rick advised against it. If you remain his mother, the child support debt will accumulate, and you won't be able to pay it off later. Chloe didn't want such a fate for herself. Therefore, she didn't put the boy in an orphanage, because with official registration, all her data would remain in the database, and she would have to transfer money for Tommy's upkeep until he was 18. No, thank you. She liked Rick's plan much better. Leave Tommy at the station in one city, and then report him missing at a completely different station. And then no one would find the ends. How wise that decision seemed then. Chloe was sure the plan would work. But in the end, everything didn't turn out as Rick and Chloe had hoped. The negligent mother was still found. And now she was here, in the colony, serving her sentence for leaving a minor child in danger. This was something she and Rick hadn't foreseen. And he turned out to be a scoundrel, Chloe hissed maliciously. That Rick, when they pressured us, he blamed everything on me, stayed clean himself. But it's all right. I'll get out of here. I'll get revenge on that lowlife. Thank you for your frankness, Eleanor thanked her, having listened to Chloe. You've truly had a difficult life. And yet, you have an apartment. You could have had a job. It's easy now. His father helped support the little boy. I just can't understand how you could give up such a miracle. Well, take this miracle for yourself then, since you're so good, Chloe replied irritably. Not that good, Eleanor shook her head. I made mistakes myself in my time, and they won't give Tommy to me. They say I'm too old to be a mother to such a little one. Well, so be it. He lives in the orphanage. I grew up there and it was fine. Eleanor said goodbye to Chloe and left the building. A plan to save Tommy had already formed in her head. If she understood correctly, the boy's father was a good, decent person. Eleanor knew his name. She knew the city where he lived. It was Orlovsk. She knew his approximate age and the place where Tommy's father studied with Chloe. It probably wouldn't be difficult to find the man. And then she would have to act according to circumstances. But Eleanor was absolutely sure that she needed to find David. Upon returning home, the woman actively set about searching. She started by monitoring social networks. She checked all of Chloe's friends and friends of friends as well. There were many Davids among them, but none fit the description. Then the woman placed an announcement in a local news group, briefly outlining the situation. This step yielded an unwanted result. Eleanor began receiving calls from pranksters who thought it was immensely funny to introduce themselves as David and make the caller believe a crazy story. At first, the woman answered each caller with hope. It seemed to her that Tommy's father had finally been found, which meant the boy was saved. But soon, Eleanor was already reproaching herself for the rash act. Calls sometimes came at the most inconvenient moments, interrupting important matters, causing nervousness and anxiety. In despair, the woman shared the problem with her daughter when she called to ask how her parents were doing. "Mom, why didn't you consult with me?" Sarah reproached. "I didn't want to bother you. You have so much to do. I thought I could handle it myself." Delete the announcement before you're completely tormented by calls. "We need to hire a private detective. I'll take care of it." "But that's probably expensive?" "Not as much as you think, but it's reliable." But there was no need to contact detectives, because David called himself. That same evening, Eleanor had just deleted the announcement when another call came in. "I'm calling about your message in our city's news chat," a quiet male voice said on the phone. Eleanor thought it was someone calling to amuse themselves again. She had gotten used to it over the past few days, and so she answered dryly and reservedly, "I'm listening carefully." "I think you're talking about my son. My name is David. His is Tommy. The child's mother didn't let us see each other. They disappeared from the city not long ago. So everything seems to fit." "What is the boy's mother's name?" Eleanor had a control question ready that filtered out the curious and the pranksters. "Chloe. Her name is Chloe. Please tell me quickly, is Tommy all right?" "It seems it really is you," the woman concluded. "Answer a few more questions so I can be sure. Because, I've had a lot of pranksters calling me about this lately. I even had to delete the announcement." "Of course. I want to understand myself if it's my boy." "Okay. What does the little boy look like? How old is he now? Describe your son's appearance." "Tommy is almost 4 years old. He has big blue eyes, light wavy hair, a pug nose. He's smart for his age, picks everything up quickly, loves strawberry ice cream, adores animals, and constantly asks questions. Tommy is immensely curious. And he's also quite—" "I understand." Eleanor smiled. "You know your son very well and it seems truly love him. So where is Tommy now? I understand Chloe isn't with him?" "The boy is fine. Tommy needs immense help right now," the woman replied. "Something unpleasant happened to him, even terrible, and the child is now in a shelter. He's a wonderful boy. I wanted to take him in myself, but the guardianship authorities didn't approve. They said I was too old for adoption, and I immensely wanted to help him, so I found you." "Wow." David was surprised. "So you even know such details?" "I actually took care of the child myself for about 6 months. Chloe wasn't up to it. I went to see Chloe, talked to her. Otherwise, I wouldn't have found you." Eleanor immensely wanted to see David before he went to see Tommy. It was important for her to make sure he was a reliable, decent person with whom the boy would be happy. So she went to the station to meet the man. Eleanor recognized David immediately. The young man was remarkably similar to Tommy. Or rather, the boy was similar to his father. David didn't come alone. A little girl sat in his arms. She looked no older than a year. Probably Tommy's little sister. Just as blue-eyed, blonde as her brother. A pretty young woman hurried alongside the man, trying to keep up with her husband. Eleanor rushed towards this beautiful family. Seeing the young people from a distance, she understood. Tommy would soon be in good hands. If only they would give him to his father. With him, the boy would be happy. What luck that they had found each other. "Thank you immensely for not abandoning our son, for finding us." David looked at Eleanor, smiling broadly. And then he introduced his charming companions. "This is Emily, my wife, and the little one is called Lily. She's our daughter." But they didn't go to the orphanage right away. They had to wait for visiting hours. Eleanor helped the family settle into a local hotel. The woman offered them to stay at her place. Her husband and she herself would have been only too happy to have such wonderful company, but Emily flatly refused to inconvenience the hosts. "You've already done so much for our family," she said to Eleanor. "I always dreamed of having many children, and definitely an older boy. It seems this wish will come true soon." "You'll immensely like Tommy," Eleanor smiled, her chest feeling warm. "He's just a wonderful little boy." "How I've missed him all this time," David confessed. Finally, it was visiting time. The whole company, led by Eleanor, sat in the orphanage lobby, waiting for Tommy to be brought out. The staff was already aware of the situation. Some couldn't hold back tears, learning that the little boy had found a loving father ready to take him into the family. All that remained was the paperwork. To take Tommy, David needed to collect a whole pile of documents, but they could meet now. "Just don't rush to hug him right away," Eleanor instructed. "Otherwise, he might get scared. It's unlikely he remembers you." "I understand," David nodded. "Of course, I understand that my son has forgotten me. He was very little when Chloe took him and forbade us from seeing each other." "And yet, why didn't you fight for the child through court?" Eleanor asked the question that interested her. "After all, it was dangerous for him to stay with his mother." "I tried," David replied, lowering his eyes sadly. "But I was essentially a stranger to him. And to get a DNA test, you need the consent of Tommy's legal representative, which is Chloe. As you understand, she certainly didn't give consent. Tommy was needed by her as a source of income." "It clicked," Emily said. "There are many mothers like that now who live on benefits." And then a rich man appeared, and the realization, there's a man, the need for benefits disappeared, and the child was in the way. Well, that's the result. It's good that everything worked out so well. It could have been much worse. It's even terrifying to imagine what dangers threatened the little boy who was abandoned in an unfamiliar city, in a park near the station. The young woman's voice trembled. Tears welled up in her eyes, a flood that Emily tried her best to hold back. Obviously, she took the situation to heart. Soon, Emily would be a wonderful mother to the little boy. Loving, caring, understanding. "You are Tommy's guardian angel," David smiled, looking at Eleanor. "I have a child myself." Emily stroked her daughter's hair, who was sweetly dozing on her mother's lap, waiting for her older brother. "And I don't understand. I just don't understand how anyone could do that to a little one." Eleanor silently shook her head. She completely agreed with Emily. The woman had repeatedly tried to find excuses for Chloe, a poor orphanage girl who hadn't received parental love and care in her time. But her imagination wasn't enough. Perhaps there are simply people of that kind. Selfish, insensitive, unprincipled. And there's nothing you can do about it. Tommy was immensely lucky that David and Emily were now in his life. There couldn't be better parents for the bright boy. The door to the lobby finally opened. The adults turned their heads towards it as if on command. Standing in the doorway was a caregiver, an elderly, slightly plump woman in a white coat. She smiled kindly at those present and shook hands with everyone. The caregiver was holding the hand of little Tommy with huge blue eyes. The little boy had been prepared for this meeting. He smiled affectionately at Eleanor and stared with interest at the people she had brought with her to the orphanage. "Well, Tommy, these are the guests I told you about," the caregiver said to the child. "Go, meet them." The boy ran up to the adults and looked cheerfully at Emily and David. They smiled, looking at the charming boy. "So you are my new friends?" Tommy clarified seriously. "It's great that you finally came. I've been waiting for you so much." At this point, David and Emily, despite Eleanor's and the orphanage staff's warning, couldn't control their emotions. They hugged the boy from both sides, enclosing him in a cocoon of caring hands. The boy stood, blinking in surprise and smiling. Then, when the emotions subsided a little, an immensely fascinating conversation began. Tommy, as was his custom, bombarded the visitors with questions. He was interested in his future, asked about the city he would soon move to live in. It was important for him to know what his room would be like. And Tommy also declared that he was simply delighted with Lily and offered his help to David and Emily in raising her. He importantly stated that he already had experience. In the orphanage, he was the only one who knew how to play properly with the youngest residents. The little girl also clearly took a liking to the cheerful, energetic boy. She smiled at Tommy with a toothless grin and reached out her chubby little hands to him. The 2 hours allotted for the visit flew by unnoticed. Eleanor's heart sang at the sight of this wonderful picture. Everything had worked out even better than if she had been allowed to take Tommy from the orphanage. Yes, she had become immensely attached to the little boy, but now he would have young parents and a little sister. And most importantly, his biological father. No one could replace a biological relative. Orlovsk was preparing for the New Year holidays. Garlands and thematic life-size figures adorned the streets. Shop windows beckoned with announcements of winter sales. Eleanor decided not to take a taxi but to walk to David's house. Her bags weren't heavy. She had taken only a few things, just for a couple of days. She arrived. The gifts for all members of the wonderful family pleasantly weighed down her hands. With what pleasure she had chosen all of this. After that first meeting at the orphanage, Tommy didn't stay within the walls of the state institution for long. Knowing David's unusual story, everyone met him halfway. The administration, the guardianship authorities, and the orphanage staff. The DNA test was ready in the shortest possible time and confirmed the obvious. Tommy was indeed David's son. The other documents were also collected quickly. Then a psychologist worked with Tommy, explaining that the little boy would now live in a family, that David and Emily were his parents. The boy quickly accepted David as his father, but he called Emily Auntie for a long time, although he became attached to her with all his heart. The woman gave the boy immense attention, love, and affection. With her, he literally blossomed, became calmer and more confident. But still, the little boy still remembered his biological mother, Chloe, and loved her, despite everything. Emily didn't rush the child. She was understanding of his choice. And just the other day, a real pre-New Year miracle happened. Tommy, for the first time, finally addressed Emily with the long-awaited word, Mom. It made me feel so warm, so light. Emily shared her joy with Eleanor. They now talked on the phone often. Of course, Eleanor kept in touch with these pleasant people. Tommy had united them, connected them with an invisible thread. The elderly woman was grateful to fate for meeting David and Emily. Now she had true friends in her life. Yes, they had become friends, despite the significant age difference. It was easy and fun for them together. Eleanor regretted that Tommy's family lived so far away, in another city. And David and Emily seemed to miss her too, because they constantly invited her to visit. And so Eleanor finally got ready, bought gifts, got on a train, and came. She wouldn't stay here for the holiday itself, she would go home. Sarah had promised to visit her parents for the new year and hinted that she wouldn't be alone. Probably, she would finally introduce them to her fiancé. And then grandchildren wouldn't be far off. Soon, very soon, little ones would appear in Eleanor's life, in addition to Tommy and Lily, who had already become like family. The snow crunched loudly underfoot and sparkled beautifully in the light of the street lamps. Here was the right house. They were waiting for her there. Tommy would rush to hug her from the doorway, and of course, immediately bombard her with questions. He would probably ask about the train, about the journey. Eleanor was greeted warmly. A laid table awaited in the living room, and the aromas of delicious pastries drifted from the kitchen. The evening was warm, heartfelt, and cheerful. Eleanor enjoyed talking with David and Emily, listening to new funny stories about the little ones. And yes, life with such tiny ones simply couldn't be boring. The young parents looked a little tired, but immensely happy. "Our family became complete thanks to Tommy," Emily confessed. "With his appearance, I understood that we were missing exactly such a little boy." David looked at his wife with tenderness and love. It was obvious that he was grateful to her for her attitude towards his son. Yes, the man was indeed lucky. People like Emily are rare after all. And then Eleanor played with Tommy and Lily, built towers out of blocks, had a tea party for dolls, and swung the children on the indoor swing for a long time, enjoying their ringing laughter. And before bed, she read the little ones a fairy tale. Both listened with interest to every word, even tiny Lily. She was in a very mimicky age now, trying to repeat everything her brother did, like a little monkey. Then Eleanor lay on the sofa in the guest room assigned to her and smiled. The household members, tired from the day's chores and impressions, were asleep. The wall clock ticked in the apartment. Sleepy, quiet, peaceful. Eleanor was used to being tormented by thoughts of Daniel before bed. She tried to imagine his life in the orphanage, without parental love and affection, wondering if the caregivers or other children had hurt him. All this was terribly oppressive, prevented her from being happy. And now, for some reason, it felt easier. Memories of the terrible mistake no longer caused such emotional torment. Tommy had somehow miraculously healed old wounds. No, Eleanor didn't absolve herself of guilt. She still felt a heartbreaking pity for her son, who had such a difficult fate. A poor, abandoned, sick boy. But the woman finally decided to tell her daughter everything. Sarah, of course, was shocked. For some time, Sarah simply blinked silently and tried to catch her breath. So struck was she by the suddenly revealed secret. But her daughter didn't turn away from her parents, as Eleanor had imagined all these years. On the contrary, she pitied them, accepted this terrible choice, even supported them. "How do you live with such a heavy burden on your soul?" Sarah whispered, hugging her mother and father. "But you were young, bewildered, and frightened, and no one supported you. My poor dears." Yes, the tragedy with Daniel would forever remain with Eleanor. But now life had become much easier. She had been given a chance to save a child so remarkably similar to her son, and she had done it. Now Tommy was in a loving family, and joy and peace reigned in Eleanor's soul.